All right, I'm back again by popular demand. So I like to think anyway. We left off here the isms of the modern world, the worldwide impact of ideology, tomato, tomato. Let's go over this again since it kind of leads into the slides that follow. What is an ideology? As it says on the screen, an all-encompassing philosophy that claims superiority to others, not always necessarily universal worldwide superiority, but sometimes that too. We could think of it as a philosophy trying to sell itself as the correct one. Remember my potted plant sort of reaching out and grabbing you example. All right, so what isms, ideologies will come into play in this class? Certainly liberalism and liberal democracy. You see the little graphic on the left there. Simplified, and this is very simplified, so once again a working definition. Democracy includes liberty, the rule of law, particularly protection of property rights, private property, free expression, equal rights, citizen participation, consent, majority rule, however with protections for the minority. Not all democracies necessarily do all of those things, but democracies that do all of those things are certainly democratic countries if they do them legitimately. But there are other components as well that we'll leave out for now. According to a really good book on democracy and capitalism both, since we live in what we often refer to as a liberal capitalist democracy, and there are others in the world as well. The writer here, John Muller, says, democracy didn't come out looking the way many theorists and idealists imagined it could or should. It has been characterized by a great deal of unsightly and factionalized squabbling by self-interested, short-sighted people and groups, and its policy outcomes have often been the result of a notably unequal contest over who could most adroitly pressure and manipulate the system. Even more distressingly, the citizenry seems disinclined to display anything like the deliberative qualities many theorists have been inclined to see as a central requirement for the system to work properly. That doesn't sound exactly like a defense of democracy, though this book is certainly that. But in the final passage here, he says, although they complain, meaning people that live in democracies, although they complain about it all the time, Democrats, small d Democrats, not the political party, have basically decided that even though democracy is distressingly, profoundly, and necessarily messy and disorderly, it's better on balance to get along without the blessings a more orderly society can bring. By more orderly, he means you could have more law and order, so much so that you have tyranny, that you have authoritarianism, even totalitarianism, dictatorship. That along with sort of our freedoms and rights comes a slightly more hands-off, government impact on our lives, and it leads to messiness and disorderliness. But that's actually part of the game of democracy. It's supposed to be about competing interests and different groups kind of competing with each other, battling it out in the political arena, not battling it out through violence, and trying to outdo their opponents, outdo other interests. That is what it's supposed to be about. So it never was really meant to work totally smoothly, nor could it, because we live in much less than a perfect world. The author I'm quoting from here, his thesis is that, and you might be able to tell from the quotes I just read, but that democracy and capitalism leave a lot to be desired. In many ways, they're lousy systems. It's just they end up being better than anything else. As Winston Churchill, who we'll come across in this very class, once said, Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II, democracy is the worst of all possible forms of government, except for all the others. I paraphrase that. That's more or less what he said. What about capitalism and its global spread? And it is global and has been for some time, with a handful of exceptions, countries that have socialist economies, communist countries. China doesn't have a socialist economy any longer, but it's still a totalitarian dictatorship, so still technically a communist country. And so there are a few countries that sort of fall outside of capitalism that don't overall participate in it, but China does economically. So what is capitalism? Again, another working definition. Good question. I'm glad you asked. So this is my own definition, and reading from the upper left: an economic system with a market economy, meaning that most decisions are left in the hands of individuals and organizations with little government interference. Such a system relies on legal protection of liberty and private property, since economic decisions are in private hands. Decisions and actions are in theory, and usually in practice, guided by supply, demand, and free competition. The price mechanism and division of knowledge maximize allocation of resources and goods. Individuals are driven by the incentive of profit and material gain under capitalism. So we live in such a system today. There are exceptions even within our system, things that get in the way of a totally free market. No society has a completely free market economy, and capitalism is controversial and always has been. So on the pro side, I quote a recent author, economist, here in a book called Reviving the Invisible Hand, in which the author claims that the rise of the West, so again, West for us means Europe and the United States primarily, the rise of the West from among a host of probably richer ancient Eurasian agrarian civilizations, which mean agriculturally based, was associated with the rise of capitalism. The rest, which he means, I think he's stealing from Neil Ferguson's title, Civilization, the West, and the rest means the rest of the world, had to come to terms with the rise of the West after its global expansion led to direct or indirect imperialism and the wounding of their civilizations. Much of the history of the rest over the last 200 years has been to find a way to achieve the modernization they all seek, all the other countries seek, while maintaining their ancient traditions. So he's making the point that whether, and he could be wrong, but whether we like it or not, or they liked it or not, the other countries, if they wanted to sort of keep their heads above water and try to get out from under European domination and control, had basically no choice but to go the route of capitalism, and particularly industrial capitalism. I mean, they had to develop industrialized economies within capitalist systems, and many countries, most have. Some of them quite successfully in recent decades, in the 20th century. South Korea is an excellent example of a successful country that's done this. On the con side, I quote a recent book, concise book on capitalism, which both is favorably inclined and critical of capitalism at one and the same time. But on the other side of the coin, the con side, at the start of the 20th century, even pro-capitalist intellectuals, quote, feared capitalism's growing tendency to become compulsive and meaningless, and that the system might be imperiling freedom, spontaneity, and humanity in the fullest sense. Conservatives and leftists alike feared capitalism as an unstoppable, erosive force, replacing traditional morals with contracts, community with society, and social ties with market calculation. And many of those, maybe all of them, are legitimate concerns and legitimate downsides of capitalism. Conservatives, who usually are thought in our country to be completely pro-capitalist, are not always that as much as you think. Traditional conservatives, not necessarily economic conservatives, tend to be critical of the ways in which capitalism can break down traditional values and traditional communities and traditional families, traditional religion, etc. So there's plenty to complain about with regard to capitalism as well. I would say this in the end, however, that it's quite possible, though arguable as well, that it's like the author who I quoted, about democracy, where yeah, capitalism is rough and brutal and awful, but there isn't anything that's sort of a proven superior to it, and it might be then a lesser evil. It seems to me that an institution, this is quoting that guy, Muller, it seems to me that an institution is likely to be fundamentally sound if it can function adequately when people are rarely, if ever, asked to rise above the ignorance and selfishness with which they have been so richly endowed by their creator. They're saying people as a whole, human beings in general, are so ignorant and selfish that we should probably take what we can get. So again, his book about capitalism and democracy is exactly from that perspective. Imperialism / colonialism. This one will certainly come up in this class on multiple occasions. Our working definition here is, and this is a very broad definition for sure, when a bigger, more powerful nation controls the government, economy, finances, land, labor, resources of another, smaller, less powerful country. That keeps it very broad. There are two types of empire. Formal empire, which is the one we usually kind of think of as empire, which is about colonies, colonialism, establishing and controlling a colony, hands-on, direct control. Colonizing, the colonizing country makes the decisions and makes the laws. So this is a more, again, sort of hands-on, direct form of control of getting what you want, in which you sort of govern the country. You send in your own governors and bureaucrats and leaders, and sometimes police forces, civil servants. The country that you've made a colony, forced to become a colony of yours, adheres to your laws. They might have to sort of, watch your flag being raised in the capital city every morning. That doesn't mean that it's not meshed with the laws and customs and traditions of the country that's being colonized. That's often the case, or maybe always the case to one degree or another. Nonetheless, there's an attempt by the more powerful, bigger country to take formal and if not complete control, but quite formidable control. Informal empire is quite different. The subject country, the colonized country, retains independence and at least nominally direct or formal control over government, finances, taxes, etc. But the more powerful country is able to control the government, economy, etc. indirectly, without sending in a governor and troops and civil servants and a court law system that's British instead of Indian. If we're talking about British India, they get what they want indirectly through various economic, political, diplomatic, and strategic pressures. We'll see examples of this in the class as well, so that. And the informal version is sometimes the preferred one because it's cheaper and it's quieter. People in the home country, people in the colonized country don't know what's going on because you don't have a strong presence there. Maybe you don't have really even a visible presence. You might have sort of one ambassador or agent, as they sometimes call them, who sort of lives in residence there and gets a message from his employer, the British government, saying, I need you to go see the king or the president of this or that country and tell them we want this and we need that. The guy goes and gets a meeting casually not casually, but he gets a formal meeting, but he's probably on casual terms with the guy because he's probably met with him many times. And it's often all polite. They maybe even like each other. They exchange pleasantries and small talk and how's your family, and they may have even met the family, been at dinners together before. But then, as they're sipping tea and eating cookies, the British agent politely says, Her Majesty's government would like it if you did this or that. Something like, we'd like it if you opened up your country to more of our corporate products, more of our business dealings. You only sort of allow a limited amount of our companies to come in and sell our wares and products in your country. We'd like you to do more. And he doesn't have to get nasty about it because the king, the president, everybody else in the room understands what's going on. He can ask politely because everyone knows it's not really asking politely, it's really a demand. Because if you say no and don't do it, the British government, my employer, will have to probably find other means that won't be quite as polite and nice to get what they want. And sometimes then informal empire becomes formal empire when a country that's been colonized formally gets sick and tired, as they usually do, of being kicked around and ruled by a foreigner or foreigners, and stop cooperating and refuses to go along any longer. And then often the troops are sent in, and the more powerful country does annex the smaller country as a colony. So often it goes from informal to formal empire. Are there any benefits to empire? Empires are all bad, right? Well, it's easy to conclude that, it's certainly true in many ways. Empires have, going back to the ancient world, have shed a lot of blood in conquering people, usually by force, to get them sort of under their sort of imperial control, to colonize them. The Romans come to mind, but there are plenty of others in world history around the world. But something can be said on the positive side of the ledger too, although, again, we don't like to. And as one historian that I like says, I forgot to put his name on here, but you may have heard of him, a recent sensation in the historical profession, an Israeli scholar named Yuval Harari, Harari, and his first sort of breakthrough book was called Sapiens, right, for Homo sapiens, just Sapiens, an excellent book. This is a quote from that book. "It's not our kind of story," Harari writes. We like to see underdogs win. But there is no justice in history. Most past cultures have sooner or later fallen prey to the armies of some ruthless empire, which have consigned them to oblivion. Empires too fail, but they leave enduring legacies. Almost all people in the 21st century are the offspring of one empire or another. So what he's saying there is that whether we like it or not, whether empires are good or bad, evil, all bad, they've been with us for a long time, and we're all kind of the product of them. So if we're the product of them in societies that work and function, overall happily and peacefully, maybe it can't be all terrible. Just to give a couple examples to show us this, one could talk about, say, the original Muslim conquests just after the death of Muhammad, which spread Islam to a large chunk of territory outside of its origins in what's now Saudi Arabia. And so Muslims today wouldn't have reason to sort of see those conquests as all terrible and all bad. For people who are practicing Muslims, and it's an integral part of their lives. In some cases, maybe the most important part of their lives, or at least a part. But they wouldn't have reason to think that empire was all bad. Another example, and there are others that we could use as well, the Habsburg Empire. That existed for hundreds of years in Central Eastern Europe, centering at Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs, but their lands, empire encompassed so much territory that they ruled over Czechs and Serbs and Hungarians and Poles and some Italians, etc., etc. And that empire and others like it have some advantages. There's disadvantages too. There's always a downside to these structures, but empires tend to be big and sprawling geographically and demographically, and so they then, like the Roman Empire, tend to take on a lot of different peoples under their control. But in a way, it sort of forces them all to get along, and the government, the Habsburg family in this case, and their ministers had reason to have everyone get along. if not because they wanted to spread sort of, the concept of sort of human togetherness and, human love, love of humankind, just to keep sort of the law and order and security and stability. They had a reason to force everyone to get along. So these empires are sort of multicultural, multi-ethnic, in a way that does see, and the history shows this, that does see certain prejudices of other people start to wane. So in the Habsburg Empire, though there was certainly still anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, it did decline somewhat. And after the Habsburg Empire broke up, and was broken up by the Austrian loss in World War I, and broken up by the victorious powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, to name the big players, and broken up into smaller chunks, like Czechoslovakia, Poland, and on. Guess what? Those now nationally oriented countries, where it's like almost all Poles or almost all Serbs or Czechs, and it's never completely all, but much the societies now, these smaller countries, these portions that we were once parts of a larger Habsburg Empire, but they now are homogenous. There's not as much cultural diversity because borders are being drawn around, again, Serbs, Czechs, Poles, it's Hungarians, etc. And you start to see old prejudices, ethnic and religious, return, anti-Semitism being one of them. So those are just two examples, and I could give you more, of positive benefits in empire, as well as the more obvious negative ones. I focused on the positive benefits more here, not because they outweigh the negative ones, but because the negative impact of empires is much more obvious. So I felt the necessity of explicating the other side more. The rise and influence of nationalism. So what is nationalism? This has become a common question, hasn't it? Well, when sort of a person's identity or a group of people's identity more and more comes from their association with their nation. So if you answer the question, if somebody says, well, how do you describe yourself? Who are you? Right? Well, I am, usually we have multiple aspects to our identity. But if at or near the top of the list is, what country you're from, that's sort of nationalism speaking. So I am an, American, or I am a Frenchman, I'm Japanese, I'm, proudly Russian, whatever it may be. The higher that aspect of your identity is on the list, the more nationalism has taken hold of you and your country, or your fellow countrymen. If in fact many are thinking more and more that way, and nationalism really became a thing and an increasingly potent force in the world in the 19th and into the 20th century, and still around now. Is nationalism good or bad? It depends on what you mean. It depends on what kind of nationalism you're talking about. It depends on who you ask. So let's ask 4 different authors. Marvin Perry, history professor, who writes, nationalism is a conscious bond shared by a group of people who feel strongly attached to a particular land and who possess a common language, culture, and history marked by shared glories and sufferings. Nationalists contend that one's highest loyalty and devotion should be given to the nation. They exhibit great pride in their people's history and traditions, and often feel that their nation has been specifically chosen by God or history. That's when it can get quite extreme. They assert that the nation, its culture and history, gives meaning to an individual's life and actions. Like a religion, and nationalism does take on the qualities of religion some of the time, nationalism provides the individual with a sense of community and with a cause worthy of self-sacrifice. Robert Wright, a gifted kind of multifaceted intellectual, in a really good book that he wrote a couple of decades ago now, said this sinewy sentiment, speaking of nationalism, if used deftly by leaders, can erode the power of local rulers, expanding authority. The result is often what Benedict Anderson, another writer on nationalism, calls imagined communities, a centrally governed and culturally coherent region bound by a sense of shared heritage, shared interest, and shared destiny. In short, a nation state or a country. Imagined communities and the power of rulers and used deftly by leaders, all phrases from the quote, is telling you, at least in Wright's estimation, that nationalism is often sort of top-down, in that it's something that's created by leaders almost as kind of a myth, actually as a myth, and it isn't necessarily real. It's a way that leaders have of binding the people together, behind their leadership and their rule. It could be that the leaders truly believe the myths are necessary to bind the people together, and they believe powerfully in their country, as well as the public they're trying to convince. But it also could be at one and the same time they're trying to hold on to power or enhance their own power. Steven Pinker, who I've quoted already, one of the most well-known intellectuals, public intellectuals of our day, says, I think this is also in his most recent book that I quoted earlier, people are seen as expendable in nationalism, as people are seen as expendable cells of a superorganism, the nation, a clan, a tribe, ethnic group, religion, race, class, or nation, and that the supreme good is the glory of this collectivity rather than the well-being of the individual people who make it up, or groups seen as outsiders. So Pinker is focusing on here, and in a more critical vein, Wright's quote is more critical of nationalism than the first quote from Perry. Pinker's is critical in a different way of nationalism, saying that it focuses its attention on the importance of the collective whole and the collective group, and not so much the rights of individuals. Richard Brookhiser, an American historian, says nationalism is a given in human society. So he's saying it's there always, for sure. It supplies feelings of belonging, identity, and recognition. It binds us to our neighbors, tells us who we are, but it takes different forms from country to country and era to era. So Brookhiser thinks of it as it's natural, or it's sort of inherent to every society, but it can take on sort of positive or negative qualities. It can be good or bad. And I think the word nationalism in our current society sort of is usually used as a pejorative term, a negative term. And of course, when we're talking about white nationalism, it certainly is something odious and dangerous and despicable. But white nationalism isn't the only kind of nationalism. So we're looking at the definition of nationalism historically, not so much the way the word is used in our current politics today. But even in world history, which we're studying here, we'll look at, for instance, the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, and that's a form of kind of ultra-hyper nationalism, and extremely ugly, dangerous, despicable, inhumane. I run out of descriptive words here after a while, but there are other examples of the odious side of nationalism as well. But there are more edifying examples of nationalism as well. Something else that we'll deal with in this class, and we could take other countries as examples too, but the rise of opposition to British colonial and imperial rule in India was essentially bound together by nationalist sentiments and nationalist thinking. So as the people of India more and more kind of came together around their identity as the Indian people, and sort of rallied behind that, it gave them enough kind of solidarity and unity to, over time, effectively fight against British rule and eventually oust the British from India, and resulted in Indian independence from foreign rule. Right? Almost everybody, if not all of us, would think that's a positive thing. So there are some forms of nationalism, some examples of it that are hard to argue with as good things. So it depends again on sort of what you mean by nationalism, what kind, who you ask, which specific examples of it you're talking about. But this will be a big ism in the class, whether good or bad, both. It's a potent influence. This also has, as I said above, in some ways nationalism becomes a substitute for religion for many people. As religion, at least in the Western world, religious belief starts to wane in the 19th and 20th centuries. Nationalism is on the rise at the same time. Could be a coincidence, but many scholars believe that people still needed to believe in something, and if they couldn't believe in God or didn't believe in God or their traditional religion any longer, Christianity or whatever it is, that hole was filled by nationalism. Because like religion, nationalism, commitment to your country, right, is sort of surrendering yourself to kind of something bigger than yourself, something larger than yourself, kind of larger than life. So that has similarities again to religious belief, and maybe is part of, it's kind of a substitute religion and religious need. Lastly, socialism, Marxism, and communism. We'll sort these out more or less later on. They'll all kind of come up in the class. For now, we'll kind of lump them together. But first, the bonus question, bottom right. If this picture, right, the bottom right picture, not the one on the upper right, if this picture was the front of a t-shirt, and it is, by the way, I used to actually own this t-shirt, I don't know if I still have it or not, what two words would be on it? They're not in the picture, but they are on the t-shirt version. So picture words above that, right, where Marxism is, would be the top of the t-shirt. The answer is not Marxism. It's two words. So look at the picture, who that is, what's going on, and you tell me for the bonus, whoever you're going to get a hold of me through email or whatever, what the two words on that t-shirt are. Okay. The basics. What is socialism? By the way, Marxism is sort of the most potent and most famous and influential brand of socialism. Communism is a little more tricky, so we'll unwind that again later. Socialism is a critique of capitalism first. Socialists dislike capitalism and seek in one way or another to eliminate capitalism and replace it with socialism or a socialist economy. Economically speaking, it's a planned economy, not one that is where the production of products is dictated by supply, demand, competition, the price mechanism, but planned ahead of time by government officials whose job is to figure out how much steel we're going to need this year or the next 5 years out. 5-year plans are common in communist countries. Government/public ownership of goods and services, what Karl Marx called the means of production, so that businesses, banks, steel mills are not in the hands of capitalists or independent individual private owners, but they're government run. And so the more that the economy is in the hands of government officials planning things out and not in the hands of private entrepreneurs and businessmen, then the more socialist and actually moving towards communists that it is. There's a commitment, usually a big one, in socialist countries to redistribution of wealth, and equality of outcome. Equality can mean different things. In the liberal democracy version of equality, it's equality of opportunity. So we talked about liberal democracy at the outset of this segment. We were talking about equality of opportunity. That's quite different from equality of outcome. Equality of opportunity means that the government that's committing itself to that, like the U.S. government did back in 1787 when it wrote the Constitution. Our forefathers wrote the Constitution. They were committing themselves to, in theory, I'm not saying it's always worked out this way, to create a level playing field so that you have equal opportunity. Not saying that you necessarily have the right to sort of equality of outcome or equality of things that you have. So that's changed over time. And again, quality of outcome has in some places replaced. In our country, it's sort of now both, and they're sometimes in tandem, sometimes competing with each other. Equality to have something, right to something, like right to health care. That's something that our the framers of our Constitution did not envision. Their rights were rights and freedoms from certain things. So you had the equality of opportunity, partially because the government was required to keep the government itself, and keep other people with their keep their hands off of your property, of your possessions. So you had freedom from others, including the government, trying to sort of step in and take your stuff from you. But the most that they were supposed to do, or are supposed to do in systems, governments, societies that are governed by the idea of equality of opportunity, is no more than you have opportunity. If you take the most famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence in our country, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the word pursuit is often kind of missed. It doesn't say you have the right to happiness, it says you have the right to pursue happiness, which is kind of saying we're going to create a society that allows you to pursue it. So we're going to get obstacles out of your way as much as we can, but then it's up to you to find the happiness. You got to go out there and make the happiness happen. That's not our job. In a society or country, government that promises, mandates equality of outcome, it's going much further on saying we're going to provide happiness and everything else for you, whether you like it or not, in some cases. So on the pro side of socialism, I'm taking this from a socialist professor who teaches socialism and Marxist thought at New York University, Bertel Ollman. This is a book review he did of a famous historian's book about capitalism. It's fairly recent. He said one of Marx's greatest achievements in Capital, his most famous magnum opus writing, was to show that capitalists, understood as the owners of the means of production, do not make a necessary material contribution to the production of wealth, and therefore that production can go on without them. We don't need capitalists. We don't need like big CEOs and business owners and guys like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and etc. We don't need them. We do not need them. It actually did say that in the next phrase. So there is no good reason that they should take, and that we should allow them to take, any of the wealth, power, and status that goes with owning capital. By calling them precedents, Alperovitz, this is the guy whose book he's reviewing, seems to suggest that on the whole, cooperative and other forms of public ownership have worked quite well in the U.S., and that there is nothing substantial in any case to keep the rest of the economy from developing in the same way, which means away from kind of competitive capitalism to a more cooperative, non-capitalist system. There is, of course, a lot of truth in the first claim. The size and relative success of the non-capitalist sector of our economy is, he means kind of like co-ops and things like that, for obvious reasons, one of the best kept secrets in America. And Alperovitz deserves a lot of credit for providing us with such a clear and detailed account of it. So this comes from a pro-Marxist, because he is a Marxist professor who teaches Marxist thought, but certainly is a socialist and Marxist avowedly. On the other side, in a recent book on socialism, and you can see the title at the bottom kind of says it all, Christian Niemitz, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. I love the title. He says, and this is it's pretty clear what he's saying here. Over the past 100 years, there have been more than 24 attempts to build a socialist society. It has been tried in the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Albania, Poland, Vietnam, Bulgaria, Romania, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, Hungary, China, East Germany, Cuba, Tanzania, Benin, Laos, Algeria, South Yemen, Somalia, the Congo, Ethiopia, Cambodia, Mozambique, Angola, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, among other countries. All of these attempts have ended in varying degrees of failure. How can an idea which has failed so many times in so many different variants and so many radically different settings still be popular? It's a good question, but we'll save that for another time. You guys take care.